I'm glowing. Welcome to this program from the Open and Affirming Coalition of the United Church of Christ. Thank you so much for utilizing the chat. If you wouldn't mind utilizing the chat to let us know where you are Zooming or not Zooming, we're on StreamYard today, where you are streaming from. My name is Derek Terry, and I'm the program director for the Open and Affirming Coalition, and I am super excited to have Mitch here with us. Yeah, studio audience is applauding. Go ahead and introduce yourself to us, Mitch.
Hi, everyone. My name is Mitch Leet. I use he, him pronouns, and I am Room for All's program manager. Room for All's mission is to support, educate, and advocate for the welcome and full affirmation of people of all sexual orientations, gender identities, and gender expressions within the Reformed Church in America and in other surrounding communities of faith.
Awesome. So we're only here for an hour, so we're going to utilize the chat. See, people are still coming in, so please, if you have any questions or comments, you can utilize the chat. I'll keep an eye on it, Mitch,
Perfect.
and I'll go ahead and put your slides up, and we can go ahead and jump right on in.
So my career as an activist and an advocate began because of bullying that my friends and I endured in high school. I'm really grateful for this opportunity. Thank you to Rev Derek and Dr. Katrina for inviting Room for All to partner on this program. I have a verse that always came to mind for me when talking about bullying as a personal issue and, now still comes up. And that's Psalm 138, verse 7, which I offer to anchor us for this time together. Though I walk in the midst of trouble, you preserve my life. You stretch out your hand against the wrath of my enemies, and your right hand delivers me. So I began my career as an advocate and an activist in high school in a very rural part of the Finger Lakes region of New York State that I now call home again as well. Today, we're talking facts and action, but I'll share a couple parts of my story where they will help give us some context. We're going to talk about types of bullying, what bullied looks like versus bullying. We're going to talk about how bystanders are lesser than upstanders in these types of situations, some of the specific needs for the lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer, intersex, and asexual community, and then where to start and what we can do. We'll also have some time for reflection and questions that will come through the chat and some conversation around those as well. As an advocate supporting young people within their school settings, I often encountered this attitude that bullying is a rite of passage that all young people go through. There was always some surprise when I pointed out that the Center for Disease Control actually researches and collects data about bullying because it is that significant a form of violence. Bullying is even named as an adverse childhood experience, which is a type of experienced trauma or violence that can have lifelong effects on someone's mental health and the ways in which they interact with the world. So the research from the CDC gives us just a glimpse of how pervasive this issue is and the differences when we're talking about LGBTQIA+ youth. Their 2021 Youth Risk Behavior Survey found that 23% of students who self-identified as lesbian, gay, and bisexual experienced bullying on school property, and 27% experienced bullying online, what we call cyberbullying. In comparison, 7% of students who self-identified as heterosexual experienced bullying on school property, and 13% experienced that cyberbullying. They also found that lesbian, gay, and bisexual students are 2 times as likely to miss school out of fear for their safety. Because the Youth Risk Behavior Survey did not have a question assessing gender identity, this report does not highlight any data specifically around students who identify as transgender, non-binary, gender non-conforming, intersex, or queer. So we're missing that picture. Additionally, LGBTQIA plus youth have other social identities like their religion, ability, race, and ethnicity that can compound their experiences with bullying and harassment, which this data also does not take into account. There are 3 specific types of bullying, but they often co-occur. Physical bullying includes actions such as hitting, kicking, pushing, pinching, or taking and or damaging someone else's property. Verbal bullying might take the form of teasing, intimidation, racist, homophobic, or transphobic remarks, insults, jokes that are not funny, spreading rumors or lies or other false information, or straight up verbal abuse. Cyberbullying is that online form of bullying. And even when it occurs off of school property, most schools are still responsible for addressing that. And we'll talk about that in a little bit. But it's that online or virtual sharing of harmful texts, images, or posts, pretending to be the target and making mean remarks to others often happens, making those fake accounts. And sharing photos and videos of the target that either were not shared with permission or were taken without permission. It may also become something as serious as what is called sextortion, which is a threat to reveal either real or fabricated evidence of someone's sexual activity to extort them or exert control. That is a criminal offense right off the bat. And I bring it up not to really go into all of the details of that, but to know that that's something that very much happens to young people, especially queer youth who people try to use the threat of outing them to others as a means of exerting that power and control. Almost all states currently have a law that addresses bullying in schools. And a great resource for determining yours is the map of the country that you can find at cyberbullying.org/bullying-laws. So when looking at laws, you want to look for clear inclusion of a bullying definition. And you'll want to ask, does the law effectively communicate an educator's legal responsibilities regarding bullying? Does the law require training of all school staff? And then I'll talk about New York's law a little bit later. That's the one I'm most familiar with as an advocate. It's important to keep in mind the marks of bullying and that it's a behavior to be questioned, not a label to put on a person. Someone who is engaging in bullying will pick on their target day after day. It may not be every day, but it happens more than once. That's repetition. They usually win because the target that they choose is either smaller, younger, or less socially able to cope with what's happening in that dynamic, and that's power imbalance. There's also the component of intent to harm. So enjoying seeing the target afraid, upset, or uncomfortable. We know the word bully. I certainly have referred to people as bullies, but that's something I'm trying to step out of. And so you may wonder, why do we label the behavior and not the person? Because at the end of the day, How we behave is not who we are. And by defining someone for how they behave, we deny them the chance to change and to learn and do better. Further, this label can provide incentive to kind of fulfill that prophecy and continue to bully. We all know the hurt people line. And while it's not an excuse, in the cases of many children who bully, it's because that has been modeled for them by parents, relatives, other youth that they have dealt with previously, even teachers or coaches sometimes, or other adults in their lives. When they see that their role models don't handle conflict well, or they may not know that that's not handling it well, that may just be how they've seen conflict handled, that behavior gets learned, and then the domination, the blaming, and use of others comes from seeing that. There also might be a lack of empathy or understanding that hasn't developed yet. Simply not knowing that that behavior has consequences. They may not understand fully the impact when their intent is that they're just joking around. So there's a few things behind that. Ultimately, it's an attempt to grab onto power and attention to feel more in control, and that does not make the behavior okay. If you ask me, which in this setting you are because you're having me, I think a lot of today's anti-LGBTQIA plus bullying behavior is fueled by and has fueled the political moment that we're in. Recent events, especially the rise of anti-LGBTQIA plus laws, make these hostile attitudes appear expected or even normal in schools and communities. If you've seen a live feed of just about any school board meeting recently, you'll get a picture of what I'm talking about. We are facing down 496. This number has actually gone up since I made this slide. Anti-LGBTQIA plus bills in the US. Among the 70 of those laws that have actually passed into law this year, 7 require or allow schools to misgender transgender students, 2 target drag performances, 3 create a license to discriminate against LGBTQIA plus people, which is on top of the Supreme Court's 303 creative ruling. And then 4 censor school curriculum, including books. You've got to be carefully taught, and we're watching it happen in real time. Whether a child is being bullied or is bullying, there are all kinds of signs you can watch for. A child who is being bullied might have unexplainable injuries, lost or destroyed belongings. They may frequently be feeling sick or faking illness very clearly. There may be changes in eating habits, difficulty sleeping or nightmares, declining grades or not wanting to go to school, loss of friends or avoidance of social situations altogether, feelings of helplessness, decreased self-esteem, or self-destructive behaviors such as running away from home, harming themselves, or talking about suicide. Signs that a child might be doing the act of bullying are that they get into physical or verbal fights, they have friends who bully others, they are increasingly acting in a way that is aggressive, they get sent to the principal's office or to detention frequently, they might have unexplained extra money or new belongings, they may blame others for their problems and have a hard time accepting accountability and responsibility for their actions. And they might be very competitive and really worried about their reputation and their level of popularity. So what can we do? Rather than being a bystander, there are plenty of ways that we can become an upstander and intervene and teach young people to do the same thing. In the moment when something is happening right in front of us, you might immediately question the bullying behavior simply with curious observations. So, simple things like questioning, well, what's supposed to be funny about that? Or do you really think that's a kind thing to say to somebody? Or avoiding directing it head on, you could also change the subject of the conversation and completely divert the attention to something else. You can also use humor to say something funny that is, again, off topic and redirect the conversation that way. There's definitely strength in numbers, and bystanders who intervene as a group show that there are several people who don't agree with the bullying. So that could be a group of friends or people who don't even know each other, just multiple voices stepping up to say, this is not okay, and knock it off. Walking with the person who is the target of bullying helps diffuse potential bullying interactions and helps give them a feeling of safety and security, whether it's navigating within schools, having a buddy to go from class to locker to class, or outside of school, someone who meets up with them to walk home. That physical support of having that secondary person goes a really long way. And then if none of these immediate moment responses are possible, you can always reach out privately to check in with a person who was bullied to let them know that you don't agree with it and that you care. Finding a way to express that support and become supportive of them and their needs in that moment and in the future makes a huge difference. Specifically talking about our LGBTQIA plus youth, they can be made safer and much better supported when we identify and advocate for unfettered access to safe spaces and providers. This is both inside and outside school walls. For me, I had a designated teacher's classroom where if things got really bad, I was able to step out of the situation and go straight to this classroom to let it blow over and find support with this teacher who was an ally to me. That was invaluable. So whether that's the guidance counselor, a teacher who's supportive that way inside school, that can be a really helpful tool for young people to be able to rely on. And then outside school walls, safe spaces and providers look like being able to be open about their identity and participate in programming and groups, as well as just knowing a network of folks like primary care providers, mental health professionals, and even knowing your local advocates, just so if something, God forbid, severe does happen, you know who to call and you know that person's going to support that family. Just knowing who to call and knowing that support is out there. Also committing to using inclusive language and materials, which, believe me, is an ongoing journey, demonstrates that all are welcome and that this is something that is being taken very seriously. So one example that I can plug is the Blessings for All Sunday School curriculum that Room for All developed for age groups ranging from 2nd to 5th grade up through adults. It's based in LGBTQ history, and it teaches a little bit more about bystander intervention in a couple of the weeks, being based off of the Beatitudes and how we are supposed to treat one another. Inclusive language in our materials too, naming things like parents or spouses or partners instead of mom and dad or man and wife, leaning on those in our paperwork, in our materials that we share about our communities, things like that really help kind of clear the way for folks who diverge from those heteronormative languages. Of course, using everyone's names and pronouns where they've asked you to and every time. There may be certain settings, especially for a young person, where they may want to go by a different name and a different set of pronouns for their safety. And it can be very tricky to switch back and forth, but it's something we need to prioritize doing and really hold ourselves to a standard of, because it can be a safety issue. And that leads me to never outing someone, which is sharing someone's LGBTQIA plus identity with somebody else without their express asking you to do so. If it happens, there is assistance for navigating that is available on our website at roomforall.com. We have a whole coming out tab on our resource page for navigating coming out in general, but also what to do if someone is outed and how to support them in that. So
I just want to pop in just for a second, simply because thank you for bringing that up, because as a pastor and as a friend, there have been plenty of times where I think people are out because they're out with me, and we're in other places. And so I've learned to now, before I do anything or say anything, just like talk to people and say, so, where are we? How is this? Just to, because, yeah, like I had friends that I thought were out that were not out. So thank you for naming that.
Yeah, absolutely. Checking in and having those conversations is the perfect way to approach that and to handle that. Especially with young people asking ahead of, I don't know, a youth trip, how they'd like to be referred to, and going from there. Or even with an adult, if they've shared with you that they identify as bisexual, but that's not something they're ready to be introduced as, that's definitely something we want to avoid. So where do parents start? The number one thing that I recommend is locating the school district's policy. Every school district usually has some kind of language in their guidelines and their handbooks. And as a parent or guardian, you are entitled to see that. Sometimes you can find it in their agendas that they get sent home at the beginning of the year. There's usually the code of conduct and all of that in there somewhere. But the office should also have copies of that you should be able to see. Sometimes it lives on the website, but in my experience, it gets buried very well. So asking upfront might be the fastest way to get a copy of that policy. Like I already mentioned, reviewing your state's law specifically. So the cyberbullying.org map and then stopbullying.gov, which is the federal program, both have like conclusive state by state information about what the protections are, how it's named, etc. It's really important to talk about bullying, to bring it up and express that you're there to talk to about it no matter what. And also make your expectations clear in how we treat one another and what is and isn't okay. It's so critical to kind of think about both sides of the coin when we're communicating. Again, understanding that bullying behavior often comes from insecurity or really trying to grasp onto some kind of power or control, or maybe fit in with a group of friends. That's not an uncommon thing. So making those expectations clear of being kind to everyone, but also defining that you're a safe space and you're there to listen makes a huge difference for a young person. So my mom, who is a retired pastor within the United Methodist Church, she was very clear that I could talk to her about anything. And if I felt like I couldn't talk about it, I could write it down and leave her a note. And we would circle back to it when there was a time when she and I could just sit down and talk about it. I have a lot of memories of having those conversations with her and working with her when she would come in and advocate for me with the administration. And that was well ahead of the times. That was in the pre-DASA days that she would advocate for me in that way. So I can't overstate how valuable it is to have that open communication. And then getting organized. So advocating for the creation or sustenance of youth clubs or youth groups, as well as adult safety committees in our communities, keeps the issue in mind and ensures that there are resources to go to, especially for LGBTQIA plus youth. Having an LGBTQIA plus specific space that is theirs, whether that's a in-school club or a youth group or something through a local resource center, it gives them that access to a safe space. There's often a lot of pushback around that, and not every child is able to safely access those kinds of resources. But making sure that they're available and doing what we can to bridge those gaps and make those connections is very helpful.
We have a question.
Yes.
What is pre-DASA?
That's a great question. I forgot to spell it all out the first time, and that's my next slide.
Oh.
So, my bad. DASA refers to the Dignity for All Students Act, and that is the New York State bullying prevention law that was signed in 2013. So, this was a year after I graduated high school that this actually went into law, and it was something that, as a young activist, I was able to advocate for. So I know this like the back of my hand, hence why I forgot to actually name the full thing. So thank you for catching me there. What's spectacular about the Dignity for All Students Act is that it requires the naming of students' rights. So boards of education are obligated to include inclusive language that is predetermined by the State Department of Education in their non-discrimination policies and in their student codes of conduct. So a lot of anti-bullying policies don't specifically name that bullying on the basis of sexual orientation, gender identity, and gender expression isn't okay. In New York, they have to, whether or not the administration feels that way. That's protected here under this law. There's also an establishment of paper trails and documentation. So schools are responsible for collecting and reporting data on every single incident of discrimination, harassment, and bullying that gets reported. They have to have a form that's available to access on the school's website or easily by stopping into the school. And every single time one of those forms is filled out, they have to follow up on it. So a student can fill it out themselves, a parent can fill it out. If a teacher witnesses an incident, they are legally obligated to make a report within 48 hours. So it establishes a paper trail. It can show that repetition. That is one of those hallmarks of bullying we talked about earlier. And it gives the person who's experiencing that really evidence to refer back to and a clear timeline of what has been going on. And then the clearly identifiable point person is within every school building. There has to be a dedicated Dignity Act coordinator. They might call it something else depending on the schools. I'm not sure if they all use the same term, but that's the person who receives those reports and who does that following up. And again, school websites are required to name who that person is on their website. I believe in New York they passed a sub law that people had to make that easily locatable on their websites, but that information has to be communicated really clearly. Faith communities can do a lot to address bullying and to be a resource for youth and families who are experiencing it. So, in creating a safe haven within your church and your communities that surround it, training staff and volunteers to recognize these signs we talked about earlier and to create those supportive, affirming environments where these topics are talked about openly. So, again, not shying away from it, but addressing it head on and expressing our expectations. And if you see or hear or are feeling something going on in a relationship, we can talk about it. Organizing a community-wide event, whether that's just on your own, in partnership with other organizations, in partnership with your school districts, even if you have that kind of relationship, there are amazing resources at that stopbullying.gov site for community action. They have a toolkit that includes information about doing that type of training that I mentioned under creating a safe haven, as well as just in general ways to integrate support into community events. Modeling and messages of tolerance, respect, and love for others in our preaching, in our music, in our children's sermons especially, and just in the way we engage with one another. So relating stories to bullying and healing as well, and encouraging seeking peace while defending those in need are themes that we can find quite easily in our Bible stories. And talking about it, making those connections, really emphasizes that this is something that should be expected and that they're safe. And of course, helping to deal with it. So offering counsel, advocacy, and connection with mental health resources and other resources as needed. This may take the form of informal support, so just conversation. This may need to be prayer, something that is just prayed about regularly in general, or it can be offering that direct support to a family or a young person. But being there for a person who's experiencing bullying in whatever capacity is possible gives them another pillar of support. The Trevor Project, you may be familiar with, is a nationwide organization dedicated to preventing LGBTQIA plus youth suicide. And they have a traditional call-in hotline, they have a text line, and they have a chat-based service. They also do a considerable amount of research on the topic of LGBTQ youth mental health. And their research has consistently found that having just one supportive adult in the life of an LGBTQIA plus young person actually reduces their risk of suicide by 40%. That's a really significant impact that just one person can have. And that person doesn't have to be a relative. It can be a Sunday school teacher, a pastor, a youth group leader, just another parent in their community, a coach or a teacher. It can be just about anybody, but having that one person is so important. And it's really important that we don't assume every child has that one person, because we never really know what other support exists. And so by modeling that, by being that person, it's just insurance that, yes, there's a person on your side. Yeah, so the Trevor Project, I believe their website is simply trevor.org. After I stop sharing my slides, I'll double check on that and I can send that over. They are nationwide, like I said, and I believe they offer services in multiple languages at this point. They've grown quite considerably and are a fantastic resource. So I will make sure that I connect you and drop that in the chat. So now is a time for simply some reflection. Thinking of a time you were in a situation that involved bullying, what did you do then, and what would you do differently now?
So feel free to utilize the chat with this reflection, and we can definitely talk about that. And I can share if that's helpful to you as well, Mitch.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, I went to a pretty artsy fartsy high school. So big Midwest high school, 2,000 students, and I was pretty, I felt like when there's 2,000 students, you can kind of find your crew, right?
Mm-hmm.
But I remember in my insecurity, trying to figure out who I was, trying to figure out my own sexual orientation and all that kind of stuff. Being involved in bullying behavior towards another student,
Mm-hmm.
and I'm embarrassed by it even to this day. And we've since made up and we're friends and we're cool. But it was such a trying to fit in. Everyone else is filling in. I was such a nerd, and this is what the cool kids were doing. And then, it was just jokes, right?
Mm-hmm.
Harmless jokes and making fun of them. And at the same time, I had friends at that time who were experiencing bullying from people, and I would always take up for them. I'm 6'4". I was 6'4" in high school, and I was, a big guy. And so I would take up for them. But it was such a weird time, right? High school is hard. All those kind of things are hard. So now I would definitely not not I even now I try not to make jokes that are like that. Sometimes people are like, oh, it's just a joke, we're just playing. And yeah, even if it's funny, it's not funny, right? So
Mm-hmm.
I try not to do that, because you just never know.
Right. And there's so much unlearning that has to happen. So I grew up in my high school years. It was the prime South Park, Family Guy, American Dad days when the cool thing to do was punch down, really.
Mm.
And these kinds of thoughts got implanted in myself and my peers. And my high school was very different. There were 137 people in my graduating class, and it was the biggest that had ever gone through there.
Wow.
So very different experience, but it came with the issue of everybody knew everybody and everybody knew everybody's business. I went to kindergarten with the same kids I graduated with. So
Oh, wow.
you could not outrun anything. And it really, as an adult, still there's unlearning that has to happen, but it's a matter of being open to that feedback and constantly processing and working on that. So a punch down is when you kind of aim for someone that you personally perceive as lesser than or different than yourself to try and take the heat off yourself. So I was the only out queer person in my high school at the time, and I had a lot of very serious, very physical things that were happening. And so I can say that I definitely developed kind of this hard exterior and would say really rude things, specifically referencing our very country way of life. Very country music, cornfields, the whole 9 yards, to try and distance myself from my peers. But that was continuing the cycle in a way that I didn't understand at the time, because I was just trying to protect myself. And I understand now, rather classist, rather negative towards somebody else's home situation, out of an effort to try and make myself feel better for what I was experiencing. So that's kind of what that refers to.
One of the things that I have found that people have found really helpful is apologizing even now for stuff that I did then. I mean, that person I was telling you about, when we went to the same college, and I just apologized profusely. And, I was in therapy at the time, and I was like, it was my own stuff. And she was like, oh, it's fine. It's fine. I'm like, no, it wasn't fine. And just going out of my way to, I'm 39 years old. So we're talking, some of this stuff was in middle school and high school, right? Just going out of my way to find people and saying, you know what, that was really crappy, what I did, what I said. And it's amazing how people appreciate that.
It's never too late to have those conversations. Absolutely. Yeah.
So and I love that, upstanders, because sometimes it's not enough to not, oh, I wasn't participating in the bullying behavior, but were you actively engaged in resisting or, pushing back against it? So I love that idea.
Right. Are there any other questions that we'd like addressed, or any other reflections anyone wants to share? I'll drop my email in the chat as well. I'm always available to talk about big picture things, specific things. I can't get that advocate thing out of my brain, so I'm always happy to help process and brainstorm solutions.
What is some of your ideas around siblings? Something like, I remember my sister and I were at daycare together, or, we're at the same school. And how do you talk to your children around, one, not just how they interact with other kids, but how they even interact with each other? And there's some of the examples you gave of bullying behavior. I was like, oh, that can be some sibling stuff too.
Well, I have 3 older sisters. I have one that I grew up with. We were 3 years apart, and she's my older sister. And we were absolutely at each other's throats as children. We did not like each other. We did not get along. And I distinctly remember our parents making it very clear to us that how we treated one another showed everybody else how they were allowed to treat us. And so, my sister, she would tease me, and we had arguments over things like breakfast cereal, because we're kids and we're in close quarters. But she would see somebody else tease me on the school bus, and it would be a complete different thing for her. And so that's kind of what was said to us, that I know in my house really kind of rang true, was, and we grew out of it. We definitely, she's one of my best friends, and I'm really grateful that I have her. But we both endured serious bullying in high school, and were each other's big supporters by that point. So I'm grateful we figured it out when we were a little bit younger. But that's really, I would talk to them and say, how you treat one another is a reflection of how everybody else is allowed to treat your sibling and you. and just having those simple conversations about treating others the way you want to be treated, and how to have conversations around conflicts, because there's always going to be conflicts, and you can talk about that in a way that doesn't blame somebody else or doesn't suggest like that there needs to be a fight, but just, hey, when XYZ, I feel,
Mm-hmm.
and pointing that out and being able to talk around it. It takes practice. It's certainly not going to come easy, especially to children. But the more that adults in their lives can model that, the more they will be able to pick up on it over time.
I think something that you really helped me with was the whole idea of not calling people a bully. And I feel like that's part of that. Sometimes, especially when we're trying to incite emotions and when people do stuff that we disagree with, and sometimes they are practicing bullying behaviors. But
Mhm.
just especially with us being a Christian organization and representing the Christian church, is that you are not your actions, and that whole idea of being able to change. And so I think it's also important for churches, even those that are progressive, even those that are, is that we don't use the actions of others to label them. Because then what is that teaching our children? What is that teaching people? I feel like a lot of people learned bullying behavior in religious spaces,
Mm.
and that can be on either side of that. Like our general minister and president, Reverend Dr. Karen Georgia, talks about having a big tent. Like the UCC church is so diverse and we have so many different types of churches. And how do we exist in the big tent? And that's the world. It's all these various and different places. And the church is the place where you're supposed to learn how to figure that out. So I'm going to stop calling people bullies. That was really helpful to me.
Yeah. I think having those graceful conversations with people who don't see things the way we see them and who maybe behave very differently, I think that's going to be a lifelong practice for all of us, trying to find ways to do that are productive and helpful. But definitely the church is where those conversations can start. And I see in my Room for All orbit, I actually just found out about one of our churches is doing exactly that. They're going to start having conversations around the tough subjects, and each
Mm,
they're picking a different really divisive topic, and they're going to model that graceful engagement with one another and figure out bit by bit how to be in community with people who feel differently. um, and I'm really excited to see how that goes. I don't think it's going to come out from the end a perfect solution where everyone's super happy, but I think there's going to be a lot of wisdom that comes out from that programming, and I'm excited to see them go through that.
I shared one of the.
So I definitely have some bits and pieces that are written out that I could share. Um, it's especially difficult for non-binary people to see themselves reflected in theology in the Bible. One thing that was really, really helpful to me, that may be a little bit advanced for a 12-year-old, is the work of Austin Hartkey, who is a trans theologian. His book, Transforming, taught me about how we have a God of and, not a God of or. So when we talk about being created male and female, day and night, water and earth, there's all kinds of middle space in there. It's not water or earth. There's peninsulas, right? There's mangroves, there's estuaries, there's all kinds of things in between the two that also are made and beloved by God. And that was personally something I found really helpful. So I definitely think, as a theological resource, I can't recommend anything more highly than Transforming by Austin Hart Key. But as far as my personal story and my personal journey, I can certainly share with Terry some of the stuff that I have already written. And again, anytime that open conversation is helpful, I love doing that, especially for young people, because I know what that feels like.
Put the book and a link to the website of the author and the book in the chat. And actually, Mitch and I met the first time online when we discussed the book called George by, I can see the author's face.
Alex Gino.
There we go. George is there it is. And you click,
And we
it's
fixed
actually you fixed it. It's actually Melissa. It was originally published as George, and then the author says you should cross that out, and Melissa, and that is a young adult book.
Yes. It's fifth grade, around the fifth grade reading level.
So that's a really good one. And we also read a book called The Black Flamingo with the ONA Book Club, and it's by Dean Atta. Amazing book. And that's, it's another young adult book. I'll put them in the chat now, but I'll also put them in the email that goes out.
You've got me in my library right here. This is why I keep them here.
Yes.
This is a picture book. Let's see, in the right spot. This, as an advocate and an educator who worked with young people, like elementary school age, this was my jam. It's called It Feels Good to Be Yourself, a book about gender identity. And it's by Teresa Thorne with amazing illustrations by Noah Grigney. I hope I said that right. But it's extremely diverse, and it talks about beyond the binary and all the different ways a person might reflect their own identity and what gender identity versus gender expression is in a way that's really accessible for young people. And yes, is age appropriate, because we actually know that a young person's gender identity and the way they express their gender is completely separate from their sexual orientation and who they're attracted to. These are two different things. And the sense of gender and that sense of self actually begins to develop in a young person around the age of 3. So it's really not unusual or uncommon for a young person to figure these things out way before anything else. And it's important for us to believe them when they tell us who they are. But yeah, It Feels Good to Be Yourself. I'll type this one in the chat too. This is my absolute favorite. I had to leave it behind in my old library, and I bought myself a new copy.
And I also think, even though, thank you so much for asking about your grandchild. But I also think there are churches all the time saying, well, we don't have any non-binary people. We don't have any trans people. And my response is always, you don't know. And these resources are really helpful for our churches and people who are trying to learn. I love young adults, and I love like children's books, because I feel like they're accessible, and all of us are children and we're children. And so there's something about reading. Like when I read George, it was so empowering and beautiful, and I learned so much. And I think that, as our churches talk about, well, what can we do? Reading these books, having them in your library, when you're talking about not doing that bullying behavior, sometimes some of the things that we do and say, we don't even recognize or realize. I know in my state, one of the laws that just passed was that a teacher gets to decide whether or not they use the student's preferred pronoun. So it's the teacher gets to say. So what does that mean? The teacher then if they decide to use the pronoun of this child that was assigned at birth, gender assigned at birth, that's participating in bullying behavior.
Mhm.
Same way people in our churches, if we don't understand trans or non-binary, or we say, oh, well, they is incorrect English, I'm just going to say this, I'm just going to say that. Learning and reading these books, it helps us to understand the importance of seeing people for who they are. And that's straight up biblical. There are lots of people in the Bible who go through transformation, who go through change, who are called different names after once they come to determine who they are. And it's just about loving people for who they are and loving them the way that God loves them, which is I always say, when you love someone, you love them the way they need to be loved, not the way you want to love them. so so
Absolutely. And that's what I was taught. God sees us as we are, made us as we are, and loves us the way we need to be loved. Absolutely. That's why when I transitioned, I chose the name Mitchel because it means made through God's plan. And I very much believe that being my authentic self was God's plan for me. And I'm lucky that I have a community that rallied around me to help me continue to hold that belief. And I'm glad that I'm able to do the work of Room for All and in partnership with organizations like the Open and Affirming Coalition. The more we can do together, the more people hear these messages, and hopefully the more hearts and minds we can change.
Absolutely. And it's also very important to me that parents do not participate in that bullying behavior towards their children. I always tell parents, if you whatever you say, you can't unsay it, your child can't unhear it. I was watching a video the other day where, Dwayne Wade, his daughter Zaya, is trans. And they were asking, well, how did you do with the transition? How did you do with the transition? And he says, I feel like she really didn't transition. I feel like she was always this person. I just had to, oh, okay, understand it was my idea, my plans, not who she was or her plans for her life. Like, she's always been the same. I had to understand. And the question, whenever people get mad at him for accepting his daughter, and I'm always like, so what's the alternative? What what is the alternative? So we hold up that mirror. So I think a lot of work is helping our children, helping parents and grandparents and aunts and uncles to just love the creatures that God has put in your life. And that's what our churches do. And we just love. Did you put your email in the chat?
I did, I believe.
Okay,
Yep. But I'll
I
drop
can
it
pin
again.
it. Awesome. I'll pin it so that people can see it, or I'll just put a little star behind it. Thank you so much, Mitch, for doing this. I knew you would be perfect, and you did not disappoint.
Well, I'm happy to help and jump in anytime.
So if you registered for this, I will send you an email. The email will just have a brief survey. We just ask you to fill it out so we can make sure that we're doing the programming work that you need. You'll also get a link to the full video of this presentation, and in that email, you'll get a link to our YouTube upcoming webinars. We have one on AI in ministry that we're excited about, and it's controversial, but that's the whole point. Is we just want to see, like, what is the moral and ethical side of this, but how is it being used for ministry? And then we're also looking at social media and developing your brand and all that good stuff. So you'll get information on all of that, as well as all the links in the books that we talked about, how you can find Mitch and Room for All and that amazing curriculum. My church is using it right now. It's amazing. It's free. You can get on their website, download it, print it off. And it's literally from itty bitty children all the way up to adults. There's different versions, and it's amazing.
So glad you love it.
I do. So thank you all so much. And watch out for the email. Thank you again, Mitch.
Of course. Have a good night, everyone. Thank you for coming.